He loves describing the journeys to the hideouts. He loves all the incognito meetings, the conclaves with unscrupulous politicians and terrorists.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
The deepening ties between China, Russia and North Korea would certainly have some in Washington concerned.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language.
The IDF will continue to uphold the ceasefire agreement and will respond firmly to any violation of it.
I'm Roland Oliphant and this is Battle Lines. It's the 28th of November 2025 and the end of a week of tumultuous diplomacy around the war in Ukraine. It began with Donald Trump presenting a peace plan that horrified Ukraine and its allies. That was followed by a diplomatic rescue mission led by, among others, the British National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell. Since then, it's been a series of ups and downs, forwards and backwards, and mixed messages from all sides involved. For the blow-by-blow coverage of the twists and turns of this story, of course, I point you to Ukraine the Latest, our sister podcast, where you can find all the latest news about the diplomatic and military developments of this war every weekday. But this is an enormous diplomatic moment, and it's one that Battle Lines wanted to look at, partly because of the role of that one individual, Mr. Powell, a man who has begun to portray himself as something of a British Henry Kissinger, somebody who twists arms and drafts sentences behind closed doors to masterfully curate the world that he wants to live in. But how effective is he? What does he really believe? And can those beliefs really be applied to ending the Ukrainian war? To discuss all that, I sat down with David Blair, the Telegraph's chief foreign commentator, who's been thinking a lot about this question. I began by asking him whether Powell should be thought of as a hero or a bit of a villain.
That's a very big question. First of all, let's not exaggerate his role in the Ukraine diplomacy of the last week or so. He's certainly been important, but compared with the Americans, of course, he's still a relatively minor actor. But he's an interesting guy, I think, for two reasons. First, he's vastly experienced. This is someone whose diplomatic career began back in 1979. He's been at it for 46 years. He's almost 70. He spent a decade in Downing Street as Tony Blair's chief of staff, one of the very few Blair aides who was by his side throughout his time as prime minister. He then set up a charity called Intermediate, which concentrates on resolving conflicts around the world. He wrote 3 books, which I recommend. They're very interesting books. And now, I think probably rather to his own surprise as much as anyone else's, he's back in the center of power in number 10 as National Security Advisor to Sir Keir Starmer, as a political appointee, not as a regular civil servant. And that's significant because what he's doing, and what I understand he told colleagues when he was appointed that he would do, is he's Americanizing his role. Historically, there hasn't been a position of National Security Advisor in the British system. It was created as recently as 2010. But all of the 6 previous NSAs were regular diplomats or securocrats. They were part of the civil service. They stayed as governments came and went. And they tended to be based in the cabinet office, in a rather spacious office near a corridor that's a fragment of the old Whitehall Palace in Henry VIII's time. Now, Powell has changed all that. He's a political appointee. He's based in number 10. He's directly answerable to the Prime Minister. And all of that follows the American model.
And that gives him potentially more influence over foreign policy than, for example, the Foreign Secretary.
It certainly creates a potential difficulty for the Foreign Secretary. Now, our current Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, has only been in office since September. And my understanding is that there have been no great clashes so far. But institutionally, there's a problem. And there's a problem that wouldn't exist in America, because in America, there's only one ultimate decision maker, and that's the president. And both the US Secretary of State and the NSA understand that their role is to advise the president and to implement his wishes. They may well clash over influence and access, But fundamentally, they're not decision makers and they know it. Whereas in Britain, of course, it's very different. In theory, we have a system of cabinet government where the cabinet decides and the prime minister's just first among equals. Now, of course, it isn't really like that. The prime minister is much more significant. But the foreign secretary will always, in this country, regard him or herself as being a decision maker, not an advisor. And therefore, foreign secretaries will always see themselves as being senior to the national security advisor. But the question is whether that's true in reality or simply in theory.
Which makes it really important to talk about him. So just bring it back to this week. Things have been moving very, very fast. And I think by the time listeners hear this, maybe things will have moved any further. But just to recap, we had this last week, a 28-point peace plan presented nominally by the Americans that sent shockwaves through Kiev and Europe, including London, because it looked very much like something that had been written in Moscow. There's now suggestions that it was actually written in Moscow and handed to the Americans. Then the Europeans and Ukrainians came up with an alternative which looked much more sensible. What were the fingerprints on that tell you that Powell had a hand in that? What is it that makes it look Powellistic?
I think the attempted rescue mission was partially masterminded by Powell, not alone, of course. His French and German counterparts were also involved. But there are a number of elements. The previous 28-point plan would have excluded any foreign troops from Ukraine. Now, the new 28-point plan leaves that open. And that's important because Powell was one of the people behind the idea of a coalition of the willing, prepared to deploy thousands of troops in Ukraine after any ceasefire to guarantee the settlement. And that would have been ruled out under the previous plan, but it may now be possible under the new one. So I think that's a sign of his fingerprints being on it. And all in all, there's been a rescue mission. We understand that the 28 points have now been turned into 19 points, which the Ukrainians can live with. But the question is now, can the Russians live with them? And the probability is that they almost certainly can't.
You've demonstrated very well that Powell now has immense power in Downing Street. What's his clout in other capitals? And I suppose particularly in Washington here, because that's what really matters. Diplomacy is the art of persuasion, right? Can he persuade the Americans around to this European point of view?
There are signs of him having successfully influenced the Americans. If you look at the Gaza peace plan, for example, point 13, if memory serves, covers the disarmament of Hamas. And it uses a very significant phrase. It talks about decommissioning weapons and putting them beyond use. Now, that's exactly the phrase that was used about disarming the IRA back in the day. And Jonathan Powell played a crucial role in the Northern Ireland peace process. He wrote one of his books about it. And I've checked with a number of sources, and everyone agrees that the Americans would not have used those words independently. Those words must have come from Powell, probably helped by his old boss, Tony Blair, who's also shaping America's plans for Gaza. But that's an interesting sign that he does have some sway with the Americans. And of course, he's vastly experienced in dealing with them. But perhaps we can talk about the other side of Powellism, if there is such a thing as Powellism.
Oh, please do.
He represents a particular tradition of diplomacy where he thinks that engagement is the answer to everything. And for him, there is no terrorist, no tyrant who you shouldn't be willing to deal with. It doesn't really matter how horrible these people are. You should always be willing to talk to them. He believes that very strongly, and he believes it absolutely. There are no qualifications. There are no exceptions. Now, all diplomats, of course, believe in the power of engagement because that's what they do. But Powell takes it perhaps even further than some diplomats would. And that's where I would question his wisdom sometimes.
So this is interesting because you write in your piece that after 46 years in diplomacy, Powell is unusually and perhaps dogmatically certain about his views. I think that's what you're getting to. Where does that view come from? How does he get to that point that he's so certain about this, as you say?
I think it comes overwhelmingly from his experience in Northern Ireland. He dealt secretly with the leaders of Sinn Féin IRA, the late Martin McGuinness, and Gerry Adams. And he describes in his book his first secret meeting with Martin McGuinness, where he goes to a house in Londonderry and the owner had left the tea and they sat there for hours talking. And, in his mind, this contact with people who had been involved in the IRA was the key to making peace in Northern Ireland. Now, he's the first to acknowledge it wasn't his idea. There'd been a channel between the British government and the IRA established in the early 1970s. And he merely activated that channel and took it forward. But the lesson he draws from that is that this is the way you bring peace. The other aspect of that is he believes that any conflict can be resolved once it reaches what he calls a mutually hurting stalemate. Once you're at that point, all it takes, in his mind, is dogged determination to resolve the toughest issues, and you can solve anything. So in his mind, there are no insoluble conflicts. It's a very interesting point of view, but I think a fundamentally flawed one.
Why?
Well, first of all, let's focus on his belief in the power of engagement. The difficulty is, if your starting point is that engagement is always the answer, you have to believe that your interlocutor is someone who can actually be swayed by engagement. That may be false. It may well be that your interlocutor is someone like Vladimir Putin, who's just determined to rebuild the Russian Empire, that he's implacably hostile, and that all he wants to do is pursue his goals, and that all that's left for you is to try and oppose him. But if your starting point is that engagement is the answer, it may be very difficult for you to reach that conclusion, even when it's obvious. The problem is that you might end up defining the problem to suit the solution rather than the other way around.
So because you've decided the solution is engagement, therefore the problem is one that can be solved by engagement.
Exactly. You get trapped in that circular argument. And when you're, as Powell is, nearly 70 years old, and you're committed to that point of view, you're never going to change it. Yeah, it's extremely hard for him ever to come across somebody and conclude that they actually won't be swayed by engagement, even though it might be true.
The question I want to put to you is that how does that view that engagement is the answer, apply to talks with the Kremlin? The Kremlin are not the IRA in the early 1990s, nor, I suppose, are they kind of ISIS and completely deranged death cult. You seem to believe that it doesn't apply. What does it suggest to you about the shape of British and therefore European diplomacy going forward if that is the guiding principle?
The guiding principle has another difficulty, which is if your starting point is that you want to engage and you've written whole books making that point, you are more or less inviting your opposite number to demand a price in return for engagement. And that price can be, well, you need to be very careful about what you say about us in public. Don't, for example, call us a threat. Or it can be you're planning a whole raft of sanctions against us. We really recommend that you don't impose those, because if you do, we'll withhold engagement. And then if you show yourself willing to pay that price, you may actually end up emboldening your adversary to go further than they otherwise would. In other words, engagement done on the wrong terms can actually make things worse. It would be better not to do it. And the problem with Powell, I think, is that he finds it very difficult ever to grasp that point. So, for example, look at the British government's approach towards China, where the British government clearly shies away from calling China a threat, even though it obviously is. They find it very hard to say that. Why? I think the reason for that is because the Chinese must have said to us at some point, if you do call us a threat, that will make the process of engagement much harder. And if you value engagement, then of course you go along with that. And that's a difficulty because that merely invites your adversary to go further and to raise the price once you show yourself willing to pay it.
Do you think that's what's happening with the current engagement with Russia?
It could be. I don't know. It's all happening behind the scenes. And I think, in fairness to Powell, from what we can discern, engagement with Russia itself is being led firmly by the Americans. I understand Powell has had at least one phone call with Yuri Ushakov, Putin's foreign policy advisor, but that was some time ago. But the Russia track is clearly in the hands of the Americans, not him.
They certainly seem perhaps more willing to make concessions in exchange for engagement, perhaps from what we've seen over the past week. One thing struck me about what you said, he wrote this book about Machiavelli. He's a big fan of Machiavelli, as we understand. I happen to have read The Prince relatively recently, actually. One thing that Machiavelli is absolutely adamant about is that for your diplomats to be able to do their job, for your diplomacy to have any kind of traction or credibility, it has to be backed by credible military force. The way he talks about it in Renaissance Italy is you've got to have your own army. You can't have mercenaries because you can't trust them, and you can't have troops lent by another power because ultimately their loyalty isn't to you and it can be taken away. I'm wondering how that fits into what we're seeing. You say Powell is an architect of the so-called coalition of the willing. One of the problems with the coalition of the willing seems to have been from the word go that it depends on ultimately an American backstop. Do you think he recognises that problem? And do you think that he would grasp, as a student of Machiavelli, that part of Europe's problem, Britain's problem, is in a way not having its own credible military force?
Yes, I'm sure he would acknowledge that. Powell is not a peacenik. Powell is someone who was involved in the decision to invade Iraq back in 2003 and defended it for many years afterwards. Powell would certainly accept the need for hard power to back up your diplomacy. And the fact that Europe can't deploy thousands of troops in Ukraine without the assurance of an American backstop, as it's called, is a reality that they have to live with. But of course, it would be much better if Europe were capable of doing this kind of thing independently. Decades of defense cuts have made that impossible.
We see this chap, he's involved in the European rescue mission, trying to make sure that however the war ends, it ends in terms that are not completely unpalatable to Europe, Britain and Ukraine. He's sitting in Downing Street. He may well be running Keir Starmer's foreign policy to a degree that no previous national security advisor ever has. I suppose it strikes me that he comes from an era of fundamental optimism. This is the era of the Blair years, of the Good Friday Agreement, of the end of conflicts, of the era when liberalism was going to triumph and it was a matter of intervention, things would work. I'm wondering if you think people like that, or he in particular, or his brand of diplomacy that has emerged from the lessons of that era is really fit for the current era, for an era of, essentially an era of confrontation and war.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. And I think there could be something in that. Powell's books show that fundamentally he's an optimist. I'm particularly struck by his argument that, any conflict in the end can be resolved. There's no such thing as an insoluble conflict. Those of us with a slightly more pessimistic view of humanity would dispute that. The Romans fought the Parthians for 700 years. The peoples of the Iberian Peninsula fought their Muslim conquerors for 800 years. History shows that there have been plenty of pretty intractable conflicts over the years, which have only been ended by the total defeat and annihilation of one side or the other. Now, Powell would say that things are different today. Well, how different are they really? You could be right. This is no longer an era for theories of conflict resolution, for faith in the power of engagement. Perhaps this is a much bleaker era where what's needed now is resolve to identify our adversaries and defeat them.
I wonder, David, whether this moment that he talks about a lot, which you've referenced, this secret meeting with Martin McGuinness in an IRA safe house in Londonderry, has kind of coloured his feelings about how diplomacy should be done.
Yes, a very strong impression from all of his books is that Powell is absolutely besotted with the glamour of secret diplomacy. He loves describing the journeys to the hideouts. He loves all the incognito meetings, the conclaves with unscrupulous politicians and terrorists. And you do end up wondering, is he capable of assessing dispassionately whether these efforts actually achieve anything or whether they might even cause actual harm? Or is he just so bewitched by the glamour of it all that he's beyond the point where he can assess it objectively? I suspect it's the latter. I think he just loves it all a bit too much.
David Blair, the Telegraph's chief foreign commentator there, speaking about Jonathan Powell and his influence on international affairs. Coming up, has all this diplomacy actually brought peace any closer? And are Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin any closer to closing the gap between them? Welcome back. This is a story that's moving incredibly fast, and it has the potential to become massively significant if the war ends this week or by Christmas. It could also be a flash in the pan. So to discuss just how close we are to actual peace, I turn to Arysia Lutsevich, director of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. I started by asking her what she makes of Powell's interventions.
If we're talking with Jonathan Powell, there's a certain division of powers between the coalition of the willing, where French are playing more on the EU autonomy and Europe being prepared to defend itself against Russia without United States. And UK is kind of counterbalancing that by saying, let's give it a chance and make sure Americans are on our side. We know that he's briefing Ukrainian negotiators before they go and talk to Americans. I think that's useful, right? Because it's always good to have somebody by your side who understands United States. I mean, how well Jonathan Powell understands Russia, that's another question. And I think because we're seeing so much informal relations and politics, including business, Witko's son, Jared Kushner, Dmitriev, the people whose intention and motivation is driving some of these deals are not coming from the foreign ministry or the official channels. There's a lot of unofficial channels and Trump's organization and all these groups. He can strengthen Ukrainian capacity to talk to Americans. I think that's valuable. But also I think we all, and not only him, fundamentally underestimate Russian regime and how much this is existential for Putin's survival as a dictator, as the head of modern day Russia, and how much he uses negotiations to play Washington against Kiev and Washington against Europe, and what he can do against that, it's not very clear, because it's not negotiating between, two regional powers in the conflict over some resources or land. This is not a conflict about territory in the end. This is the conflict about spheres of influence that Putin wants, and about him having a diminished presence of United States in Europe. This is what he wants to achieve. And that's a big task to handle.
I suppose the point about Powellism is this belief that engagement is always the answer.
Yeah.
That there's no one you don't speak to, and eventually, whether you're speaking to the IRA or Al-Qaeda or the Russian government, you will find moderates and you will find some way you will muddle through. It sounds like you worry that there's a misreading of the Kremlin and its interests and obsessions.
And also, it's about what you do alongside talking. It's okay to talk. It's okay to understand the sides. But what is UK government doing to back up that position, to change Putin's calculus on the battlefield? We all know that Putin will only come to the negotiating table when he will either face a humiliating defeat, which is not, or some kind of a deal that will save his face. He's not there yet. So what is his incentive to negotiate in earnest? I don't see it. And this is where there's a lot of criticism of current coalition of the willing, that they are not backing their statements, their rhetoric, by resources, deeds, and changing the calculus in Moscow.
Well, where we are, we've had a week now, or maybe even a little bit over a week, of absolutely frantic diplomacy. And maybe sometimes more noise than heat, or heat than noise, or whichever way the metaphor is meant to go. We are now speaking on the morning of Thursday. Where do we stand right now? I mean, how close are we to this end of the war that Donald Trump promised us about a week ago?
Well, Roland, I think this whole diplomacy is not so much about peace in Ukraine, but it's about the position of Donald Trump on how this war in Ukraine should end. So Washington is being pulled into clearly two different directions. And so far, it seems like Russians are more successful in convincing Steve Witkoff and people, close to Trump, that Ukraine should make some serious concessions to Russia, that Russians' goals of military operation must be achieved. There's no change of position on that. And this is where all these back channels between Kirill Dmitriev and Witkoff were going. And now we know from more, leaks in the media that actually a lot of what was presented as an American plan was Russian plan. The fact that the senior U.S. officials agreed to play along this game, whether they were fully aware or suspicious of that, is another matter. At the same time, we have Ukraine and the coalition of the willing, especially, Germany, UK, and France, mobilizing on the counter proposal. As we speak right now, we don't know fully the position of the US. We see that Russia is already rejected the compromised plan that is leaning towards Europe, and we may be at ground zero very soon.
Yeah, this is the plan that the British, French and German security advisors came up with the Ukrainians. It is described as a diplomatic rescue mission trying to perform surgery on the American/Russian proposal. I'm just going to read out what I've read this morning, which is that Andrei Sybiha, the Ukrainian foreign minister, has said that he expects a meeting between Ukrainian and American teams, he said in the nearest future. I'm not sure exactly what that means, and that also they expect some kind of concrete movement. Andrei Yermak, Volodymyr Zelensky's chief of staff, said to Axios a couple of days ago that he felt that what's on the table now is quite solid because there are security guarantees that America wasn't making before. I'm wondering who's right here. Or is the truth is that we just don't know, that it's all a bit of a black box and we're all left guessing?
What we understand are the key points of this Ukraine-European, or we could call European, because Ukraine is in Europe, counter-proposal is that the ceasefire line is the current front line, right? That there should be no recognition of Russian occupation and furthermore no withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from its sovereign territory, right? That is the big red line both for Ukraine and Europe. And the third one, and we already had the NATO Secretary General Rutte saying that Russia has no right to dictate terms for the alliance, whether Ukraine should or should not be the member of NATO. This is the relationship between the alliance and the prospective members. So we know already that these things are no-goes for Europeans and Ukrainians. We do know that this is exactly what Russia wants, and that is why these positions remain unreconciled and possibly non-reconcilable in the future. What you've mentioned about the security guarantees, it's something Ukraine hopes, I would say, to convince Americans to participate. Because as we have seen also from most recent statements by State Secretary Marco Rubio, he said that security guarantees will be put in place after the peace agreement is achieved, not as part of the negotiations and as part of the compact between the Ukraine, Russia, and United States. So I agree, it's all very confusing. Well, one thing is clear, that Americans are not aligning their positions very much with Europeans, and Europeans do not trust that Americans and Russians behind their backs will have a good solution for Ukraine and for Europe for the same matter.
I suppose one question, there was some reporting earlier of sources in the Ukrainian government saying, look, we've never been pressured like this by the Americans. And you add on top of that the situation at the front, which is really not good. I was just looking at yesterday's update from the Center for Defense Strategies, and the Russians are back in, basically getting close to getting back into Liman, another place they were evicted from 3 years ago. So the situation is not good on the front. And did I mention that Zelensky's corruption scandal is the other issue? There's a lot of pressure on. I suppose the question is Ukraine still in a position, or is the government still in a position where it can continue to resist all this pressure? Or is the moment coming where they will have to crack and make those concessions? Because I suppose it's all very well saying, no, Ukraine cannot give up sovereign territory, it cannot accept limits on the size of its military, and so on and so forth. I suppose what the Russians want to convince the Americans of is that, no, actually they're at a position where they're going to have to give into this. How much pressure are the Ukrainians under, do you think?
This is where part of the Russian special influence operation on Trump and his people is to convince that Ukraine will lose anyway, that there is no alternative, right? It is the question of when this happens rather than if this happens. And I actually am not sure that's the case, right? Because a lot of things can happen at war. I think you're right that at this particular moment, Ukraine faces 4 crises. One, it's battlefield, right? The another one is energy. People have very limited access to electricity, in some cases 4 to 6 hours a day. Then you're having corruption scandal, which, threatens trust between allies and Ukraine in financing Kiev. And you have collapse of American assistance this year. Let's remember, Americans are not providing anything for free for Ukrainians. And that's roughly, if we remember the last number, 60 billion, that was the U.S. military assistance to Ukraine that has vanished and it was not provided this year. So all of this, of course, weakens Ukraine. The question whether it weakens Ukraine enough to see it as the kind of hurting stalemate where it has to kind of cut its losses. I think on the territory, in a way, from what I read in Ukraine, this question of dignity, yes, we may lose the territory in the battle, and that is a dignified loss. But we cannot simply give this territory to Russia and retreat. I don't think that will be a popular decision neither among the military nor among the Ukrainian society. Sometimes people mention Crimea, how, Crimea was in a way, because Ukrainian army was so weak and Russians had, rolled over Crimea and without a single shot being fired. I see at this point some compromise that Ukraine is ready to make, but not the compromise that will completely undermine trust between citizens and its governing elites, because that will have a long-standing impact on instability inside the country. It will lead to a peace that people will not accept, and it will create, failed state in Ukraine, a gray zone, something that will not be able to reconstruct, integrate with the EU, and will allow Russia to make further encroachments. So I think this is the fear, that this has to be acceptable without feeding revisionist, moods and anger against Ukraine's national leadership.
A Ukrainian official said to me, quite a senior Ukrainian official, years ago, even when things seemed to be going quite well for Ukraine, perhaps it was in 2022 or 2023, he said, I think at some point the Americans are going to, the term he used was yank the chain. This person was very, very cognizant of the leverage that the Americans had. Do you think that's basically what's happening here?
I think fundamentally Trump believes Ukraine is the weakest side, and the weakest side should be pressured, right? I don't think Trump believes Russia is weak. Whatever facts are on the ground, and Ukrainians and Europeans were trying hard to make that case that, look, Russia has taken 1% of Ukrainian territory for losing in dead and wounded 1 million people. Is that a victory? No. But it still seems like Russia has this magic spell over Trump because of past business relationship, because of, liking of each other. We can speculate what it is. So yes, they are pressuring Ukraine, but unlike 2022, we have different Europe. And we have different Germany. We have more understanding how Ukraine is critical for European security. We have EU clearly stating that Ukraine is the first line of defense for European Union. And that is something that Washington has to deal with and Kremlin has to deal with. If Ukraine were alone, abandoned, without this European alliance, yes, Ukraine will have to make even more painful concessions. But I don't think that's the case at the moment.
What happens next, do you think? We had this flurry, this really intensive flurry over the past 2 weeks. It seems to have gone slightly quiet now. Donald Trump was talking about, Ukraine had until Thursday. We're speaking on Thursday. That deadline has vanished.
Thanksgiving.
Yeah, Thanksgiving. What's your take? Is the war going to end by Christmas, or is this another of those many rounds of diplomacy that will come to nothing because the sides are still so far apart?
Well, I think we will see more fighting and talking. This war may end, but not now, but more at the peak of military confrontation. We are not there yet. Russians are amassing more and more long-range missiles, and we see the change, the tilting of their strategy more towards long-range strikes, knowing that Ukrainian air defense is depleted. I think they want to see all these combined crises that we discussed, undermining morale in Ukraine. We are not there yet fully. And I think I just quote what we've heard yesterday in Chatham House when we had a meeting of the European members of parliament, where Ukrainian member of parliament said that, look, I think they in Ukraine do not expect that peace is around the corner. And actually, it's a very dangerous hope to fall on, because it is exactly what also Putin wants, to kind of demobilize, demoralize, to give up. Between these pressures of Russia and Washington, Europe has to face what is its existential crisis and pool resources as much as possible to look at Russian sovereign assets quickly, because as we know, Americans also have appetites for them. To make sure that these assets are directed for Ukraine's future force and future deterrence. Identify these key principles, which I think they've done quite well, on a non-recognition of territory on the current line of contact as the new territorial reality. And no, Russia has no veto over NATO. I think this should be protected. And of course, for Ukraine internally, it's key that its sovereignty remains unhinged, because if its territory is damaged, it's bad, but it's not as critical as sovereignty, and that it's right to decide on its cultural policy, language policy, religious policy, and that a lot of people understand in Ukraine, that is very, very important for how viable Ukraine state will be after the war.
Arisia Lutsevich of Chatham House there. That's all for today. We'll be back on Monday with our Start the Week edition. Until then, that was Battle Lines. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Roland Oliphant, and Venetia Rainey. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others to find the show. To stay on top of all our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can also get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Peter Shevlin, and the executive producer is Louisa Wells.